Mrs. Dalloway Part 2. As I did with Eliot's The Waste Land, I would like to read the first part of Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway in order to give you a sense of how to read stream of consciousness narrative. Here's the first couple paragraphs of Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, for Lucy had her work cut out for her. The doors would be taken off their hinges, Rumpelmayer's men were coming, and then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. In the first paragraph we are outside Mrs. Dalloway's consciousness. The third-person narrator is telling us something objective about Mrs. Dalloway. She said she would buy the flowers, which means she wants to shop for them instead of having a servant do the work. Notice that with the second paragraph we move into Mrs. Dalloway's consciousness without any cue. This technique is called direct interior monologue, which means that we get the character's thoughts directly without any help from the narrator. The narration is still in the third person, so there is no use of I to indicate the character's thoughts. Often, the word for signals a character thinking about his or her reasons for doing something. In this case, Mrs. Dalloway is thinking that her servant Lucy has a lot of work to do today. She also thinks the day is beautiful and wants an excuse to get outside. Also, in the second paragraph, notice the use of thought Clarissa Dalloway. This technique is called indirect interior monologue, which means that the narrator is operating between the reader and the character's thoughts, providing a cue that the thoughts belong to the character. In addition, the second paragraph includes the use of a dash for discontinuity, leading into a metaphor, as if issued to children on a beach. The metaphor takes us away from this particular morning in London to the feeling of a morning on a beach in general. Here is paragraph 3, taking us into Mrs. Dalloway's memories. What a lark, what a plunge! For so it had always seemed to her, when with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Burton into the open air. How fresh, how calm, stiller than this, of course, the air was in the early morning, like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave, chill and sharp, and yet, for a girl of 18 as she then was, solemn, feeling as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen. Looking at the flowers, at the trees, with the smoke winding off them, and the rooks rising, falling, standing and looking until Peter Walsh said, "Musing among the vegetables? Was that it? I prefer men to cauliflowers? Was that it? He must have said it at breakfast one morning when she had gone out on to the terrace. Peter Walsh. He would be back from India one of these days, June or July, she forgot which, for his letters were awfully dull. It was his sayings one remembered. His eyes, his pocket-knife, his smile, his grumpiness, and, when millions of things had utterly vanished, how strange it was, a few sayings like this about cabbages. Notice that paragraph 3 begins with direct interior monologue. We are inside Mrs. Dalloway's consciousness as she enjoys the day. The 4 cues us about her reasoning. Her opinion about the day is based on a memory from her youth at Burton. In the film version, if I remember correctly, the editing has mature Mrs. Dalloway beginning to go through her front door toward the London street, with a voice-over of "What a lark, what a plunge," and then young Clarissa pushing through the French windows at Burton. It's a nice way to transition visually from the sensory experience of the present into the memory. I mention the film here also because this transition is a camera-style sequence, a use of cinematic technique to capture the movement of the mind. Notice also the use of sensory detail as a cohesive aid. We hear the squeak of the hinges, which helps place us physically in the memory. Then, with how fresh, we're in Mrs. Dalloway's memory of Burton. Notice the use of typographic controls in the parentheses, which suggests the mature Mrs. Dalloway is thinking about herself at 18, and also in the dashes around "Was that it?" which indicate that the mature Mrs. Dalloway can't remember exactly what Peter Walsh had said. The dash before Peter Walsh transitions from the Burton memory into Mrs. Dalloway's current thoughts about Peter Walsh, who has worked as a civil servant in India. With paragraph 4 we get sensory detail that cues us about where Mrs. Dalloway is in the current physical world. She stiffened a little on the curb, waiting for Dirtnell's van to pass. A charming woman, Scrope Purvis thought her, knowing her as one does know people who live next door to one in Westminster. A touch of the bird about her, of the jay, blue-green, light, vivacious, though she was over 50 and grown very white since her illness. There she perched, never seeing him, waiting to cross, very upright. We see Mrs. Dalloway again on the street in London. Then the perspective shifts from Mrs. Dalloway to Scrope Purvis, who is not an important character. Again, the parentheses seem to indicate Scrope Purvis thinking about his thought that Mrs. Dalloway is charming. Notice that we get a physical description of Mrs. Dalloway, but not from an objective narrator. Almost all description in the novel is provided through a character's perspective. With paragraph 5, the perspective shifts back to Mrs. Dalloway. This is indirect interior monologue because there is a tag, Clarissa was positive, that identifies the language as part of her thinking. For having lived in Westminster, how many years now? Over 20. One feels, even in the midst of the traffic or waking at night, Clarissa was positive, a particular hush or solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense. But that might be her heart affected, as they said, by influenza. Before Big Ben strikes. There! Out it boomed. First a warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Such fools we are, she thought, crossing Victoria Street, for heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one, tumbling it, creating it every moment afresh. But the veriest frumps, the most dejected of misery sitting on doorsteps, drink their downfall, do the same, can't be dealt with, she felt positive, by Acts of Parliament for that very reason. They love life. In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp, and trudge, in the bellow and the uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwich men shuffling and swinging, brass bands, barrel organs, in the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some aeroplane overhead, was what she loved. Life, London, this moment of June. Notice again the use of sound to place us physically in a setting, in this case on the streets of London, where the tolling of Big Ben can be heard. The sound launches Mrs. Dalloway's thinking into her pleasure in being outdoors in London in June, connecting the reader to Mrs. Dalloway's experience in both time and space. The sound of Big Ben is repeated throughout the novel, becoming a cohesive element, uniting the fragments and focusing on the theme of time. I'll let you take it from here. I hope you enjoy the flow of the language. I would read all the words, not skim, and push through passages that confuse you, rather than slowing down to figure them out. It may be easier to get the gist of the action without stopping.